In 1972, a young medic carried a wounded soldier through a cloud of poison and saved his life. 50 years later, that same poison was killing the medic, and the only one who could save him was the soldier he carried. Stay with me, because this story will stay with you forever. Subscribe so you never miss stories that touch the heart. The late afternoon light slanted through the half-open blinds, painting long golden stripes across the small rehab room in rural Kansas. Outside, the wind pushed through dry cornfields, making the stalks hiss like whispers. Inside, Dr. James Jim Walker sat in his wheelchair, his hands resting lightly on his thighs. His right knee, swollen and pale, bulged under the fabric of his sweatpants, about the size of a soup bowl turned upside down. He could feel the weight of it, the constant pressure, the way it seemed to throb with its own heartbeat. Below that knee, there was nothing, no sensation, just a vague memory of what it used to feel like to walk without thinking. His chest rose and fell unevenly. Each breath came through the left lung alone, the other one nothing more than scar tissue now. The air moved in short, deliberate pulls, followed by a pause, as though he was negotiating each inhale with his body. Across the thin hospital gown, 6 pale lines traced down from his collarbone, curved slightly like old rivers on a weathered map. Each scar was the signature of a time he'd lain under bright surgical lights, while someone else fought to keep his heart working. On the small table beside him lay an open Bible, its thin pages ruffled by the draft sneaking under the door. His reading glasses sat crooked on the bridge of his nose. The words on the page were underlined in a shaky hand. "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God." He had read Isaiah 4:110 so many times that the verse had become less a line of scripture and more a companion, steady, constant, almost alive. He closed the Bible gently, the sound of the cover settling as soft as a sigh. For a moment, he just listened. The steady beeping of the heart monitor in the corner, the faint hum of the oxygen concentrator, the wind against the window pane, a low, restless moan. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and autumn, 2 scents that had followed him for decades. Jim looked down at his hands. They were large, with knuckles thickened by age and use, the skin mapped with sunspots. Once, these hands had held surgical tools steady, while artillery shook the ground beneath him. They had pressed against bleeding wounds, improvised tourniquets, lifted men heavier than himself onto evacuation choppers. Now they trembled slightly when he buttoned his shirt. Still, the hands were his, and as long as they worked, he would find a way to use them. The clock on the wall ticked toward evening. He could see the reflection of the setting sun in the polished metal of his wheelchair frame, a small golden flare, fading fast. He thought about the event scheduled for tomorrow morning, the annual Veterans Day gathering at the town hall. He had been invited to speak. Part of him wondered if he could manage it without collapsing halfway through. Another part knew he'd go, no matter what the doctors said. He reached for the call button to signal the nurse for his evening meds, but before he could press it, the phone on the table rattled against the wood. The shrill ring cut through the quiet. He glanced at the digital clock beside it, 2:17 a.m. The red numbers glowed in the dark like a warning. He hesitated, his hand hovering above the receiver, and just when he thought the storms were behind him, he picked up the phone. "Jim?" The voice on the other end was urgent, low and too awake for this hour. He recognized it instantly. Dr. Franklin, the on-call cardiologist at the VA hospital in Wichita. "We've been reviewing your latest test results. I need you to come in tonight." Jim leaned back slightly in his chair, phone pressed to his ear. "It's the middle of the night, Doc. Whatever it is can wait until morning." There was a pause, the kind a doctor takes when he's trying to measure the weight of his words. "It can't. Your echocardiogram shows severe stress on your left ventricle. The valve grafts from your last surgery are under strain. If you exert yourself tomorrow, if you even climb a few steps, you're at risk for acute failure." Jim stared at the dark window. His own reflection looked back, silver hair tousled, eyes sunken but alert. "Tomorrow's the Veterans Day ceremony. I've been asked to speak. I'm not missing it." "James," Franklin said, his voice tightening, "if you walk onto that stage, your heart might not walk off with you." The words hung in the air like a suspended hammer, ready to fall. Jim's fingers tightened on the phone. He thought of the hall tomorrow, rows of aging soldiers, some in wheelchairs, some leaning on canes, all of them wearing the weight of memories that only they could understand. He'd been asked to talk about service, about what it meant to keep going when everything in you screamed to stop. How could he stand up in front of them and admit he'd chosen to stay in bed? I've been on borrowed time for years, Jim said finally, his voice steady but soft. If it runs out tomorrow, at least I'll be where I'm supposed to be. He heard Franklin exhale, a sound caught between frustration and resignation. At least let me send an ambulance in the morning. I want you on oxygen before you even think about that speech. We'll see, Jim replied, which in his language meant no promises. Get some sleep, Doc. He hung up before Franklin could argue further. The quiet returned, thicker now. He could feel the thud of his heart in his chest, not fast but heavy, deliberate. Each beat a reminder that it was still there, still working, still his. From the adjoining room, he heard Mary stir. She appeared in the doorway, her robe wrapped tight, her hair loose over her shoulders. Who was that? Franklin, Jim said, just checking in. Her eyes narrowed. She could always tell when he was leaving something out. And, he said, offering the faintest smile, he wants me in the hospital instead of at the town hall tomorrow. Mary stepped into the room, the soft padding of her slippers barely masking the weight in her voice. Jim, maybe you should listen to him. You've been… She stopped, searching for a word that wasn't worse or weaker, different lately. I'm fine, he said, though both of them knew it wasn't true. They asked me to speak. I'm going. She crossed her arms, tilting her head in that way she did when she was bracing herself for a fight she wouldn't win. You're stubborn as hell. That's what you married me for, he said with a small grin. But when she turned to go back to bed, his smile faded. He watched her disappear down the hall, the sound of the bedroom door closing with a soft click. Alone again, Jim wheeled himself closer to the window. The fields outside were dark, the only light coming from the porch lamp. In the glass he saw his own face, and for a moment, another one layered over it. The 29-year-old captain in fatigues, eyes sharp, jaw set, hands steady on a scalpel under a flickering lamp. A younger man who never would have thought twice about tomorrow. The beeping from the heart monitor ticked on. He closed his eyes and tried to rest, but instead his mind began to drift back to the sound of monsoon rain on canvas, the smell of antiseptic mixed with wet earth, and the thud of helicopter blades somewhere above. The memories were as close as the next breath, and just like that, without warning, he was back in Vietnam. The sound came first, the low rhythmic chop of rotor blades beating against the heavy air, then the smell, smoke, mud, and something sharper, acrid, that burned the inside of the nose. Captain James Walker stepped out of the tent, squinting into the rain, his poncho snapping in the wind. Beyond the clearing, one Huey was dropping fast, its skids already dripping with water before it touched down. The medic jumping out of the side door waved him over, shouting against the noise. We've got a bad one, Cap. 19-year-old, shrapnel in the abdomen, lost a lot of blood. Jim ran forward, boots sinking into the mud with each stride. Rain poured down in sheets, blurring the lines between the men hauling the stretcher and the jungle behind them. He recognized Corporal Tommy Reed among them, his helmet tilted back, his face streaked with rain and dirt. Tommy's eyes locked on Jim's for a split second. No words, just the look that said, this one's hanging by a thread. Inside the surgical tent, the light was dim, a single kerosene lamp swaying gently from the central pole. The canvas walls shuddered with each gust of wind. The operating table was nothing more than a thick wooden door laid across two crates, covered in a green tarp. Supplies were stacked in mismatched boxes. The air smelled of alcohol swabs and damp fabric. Somewhere outside, the deep thud of artillery rolled through the ground. They transferred the young soldier, Private Michael Harris, onto the table. His uniform was shredded from the waist down, the fabric dark and wet. His skin was pale, almost gray, his lips tinged blue. His eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused, then rolled back. Jim pressed his fingers to the boy's neck. Faint, rapid pulse. Let's move, he barked. Tommy was already stripping off his gloves from the chopper run and pulling on a fresh pair. We're low on O negative, he said, his voice tight. And the generator's out, no lights but the lamp. Jim glanced at the tray. No blood supply that would last the surgery. No portable suction that worked in this weather. He didn't need to say it out loud. If they didn't find a way to keep Harris's blood circulating, they'd lose him before sunrise. The shelling outside crept closer, the explosions now sharper, more defined. The kerosene lamp's flame flickered each time the tent walls flexed in the wind. Rain hammered the roof, dripping through in tiny streams. Jim's hands moved quickly, cutting away the last of Harris's uniform, exposing the wound. A jagged, gaping tear along the lower abdomen, fragments of metal glinting inside. The bleeding was steady, pooling darkly beneath him. Tommy, give me the IV tubing, cut it here. Jim motioned, slicing the tubing at an angle. He grabbed a length of sterile silk suture and threaded it through. "I'll bypass the damaged vessel until we can get him out of here. We're making him his own bridge." Tommy nodded, his hands moving with the same speed. Outside, someone yelled for cover, followed by a crack of gunfire in the distance. The tent shuddered as another shell landed somewhere nearby. Jim blocked it out, leaning closer under the lamp's thin light. Each stitch had to be exact. One slip and the fragile seal would burst. Michael moaned faintly, his head shifting. Jim spoke without looking up. "Stay with me, Private. You're not going anywhere tonight." The boy's breathing hitched, then steadied again under the mask Tommy had secured over his face. Minutes stretched into something slower, heavier. Jim felt sweat bead along his temple despite the damp cold. His fingers worked automatically. Measure, cut, tie, check for flow. The makeshift bypass began to hold. The bleeding slowed. Outside, the Huey's blades started up again, the sound growing louder as the crew prepped for evacuation. "Pressure's holding," Jim said at last, sitting back just enough to let Tommy dress the wound for transport. "He's got a chance." They secured Harris to the stretcher, wrapping him in blankets to fight the chill. As they moved him toward the tent flap, the rain seemed to come harder, like the sky itself was trying to keep them there. Jim walked alongside, one hand on the stretcher frame, his other gripping the lamp to light the way. At the helicopter, the crew chief shouted over the roar. "Where are we taking him?" "Field evac to Pleiku," Jim called back. "Tell him he's got a temporary bypass. Get him to a full surgical unit fast." The crew nodded, lifting Harris inside. The boy's face was pale but less ashen now, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Jim leaned in close so only Harris could hear. "You're going home, son. You hear me? Home." The rotors kicked up sheets of water, blinding and deafening all at once. Jim stepped back, shielding his eyes. The Huey rose slowly, then turned toward the dark horizon. As it disappeared into the rain, the battlefield noises seemed to creep back in. The artillery, the distant gunfire, the unending patter of rain on mud. Jim turned toward the tent, Tommy falling into step beside him. "You think he'll make it?" Tommy asked. "He has to," Jim said, though part of him knew how many times he'd said those words before. And as they walked back through the clearing, the mist was already starting to settle over the grass, thin, pale, and silent. He didn't know then that the mist was more dangerous than the bullets. The rain had slowed to a steady drizzle by the time the order came through. Jim was still peeling off his soaked gloves when the radio crackled from the command tent. The voice was tight, clipped. "We've got 2 men down, grid reference Delta 7. No chopper in this weather. You'll have to go in on foot." Tommy stood beside him, tightening the straps of his helmet. "That's halfway to the tree line," he said. "That area got hit earlier." Jim nodded, already pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. He'd seen the strange haze drifting over the fields that afternoon, white, low-hanging, almost pretty in the fading light. The pilots had called it the spray, a new kind of defoliant meant to strip the jungle bare. Nobody talked much about what it did to people, they just said it cleared the land. They grabbed their med packs and stepped into the night. The air was heavy, almost still, except for the faint hiss of rain on leaves. The ground squelched under their boots, each step pulling against the mud. Jim could feel the mist before he could see it, a cool dampness that clung to his skin, different from rain. When the first wisps appeared ahead, curling low over the grass, Tommy hesitated. "You smell that?" Tommy asked, pulling his scarf up over his mouth. Jim caught it then, a faint chemical tang, sharp and sweet at the same time. "Yeah, keep moving." They pushed into the haze. The moonlight caught it in swirling layers, so dense in places it seemed to form walls. Jim's eyes began to water, a faint burn settling in the back of his throat. He ignored it, focusing on the muffled groans ahead. Somewhere to the left, a man called out weakly for help. They found the first soldier lying face down near the roots of a splintered tree. His fatigues were damp with blood along the shoulder. Jim knelt beside him, rolling him gently onto his back. The man coughed, a wet rattling sound, his eyes glassy. Jim checked the wound, clean through the shoulder, bleeding but not immediately fatal. Tommy was already moving toward the second voice. "Over here," he called. Jim dragged the first man a few feet into clearer ground, then joined him. The second casualty was worse. Shrapnel had torn across his lower chest, and every breath bubbled red at the wound. Jim pressed gauze into place, feeling the warmth of the blood seep instantly through the layers. "We need to move them now." They rigged quick field dressings, working by touch more than sight in the shifting mist. Jim's hands felt slick inside his gloves, his breath shorter now. The chemical tang was stronger, clinging to the inside of his nose. He could taste it when he swallowed. "Let's get them out," he said, his voice rough. Tommy shouldered one end of the first stretcher. Jim took the other. Each step was harder than the last. His boots felt heavier, his knees stiff. By the time they reached the edge of the haze, his lungs were burning in a way that had nothing to do with running. The drizzle turned back to rain, washing thin streams of the white residue from their sleeves. They handed the first casualty to 2 waiting soldiers, then doubled back for the second. The mist seemed thicker this time, the air hotter, as though the ground itself was exhaling. When they emerged again, Jim's head was buzzing faintly. His vision swam for a second before snapping back into focus. He set the stretcher down near the med tent, coughing hard into the crook of his arm. The cough lingered, deep and tight, until his ribs ached. "You all right?" Tommy asked, frowning. "Just swallowed some of that swamp air," Jim said, forcing a half smile. "I'll be fine." But later, lying in his cot, he could still taste it, bitter at the back of his throat, sharp enough to cut through the smell of wet canvas and kerosene. It clung to his hair, his skin, the inside of his mouth. He closed his eyes and told himself it was nothing, just another night in the field. Outside, the rain carried the mist deeper into the earth, down to the roots in the water, into everything it touched. Years later, Jim would still remember that night, the shape of the haze rolling over the grass, and he would realize it had followed him home, not as a memory, but as something far more permanent. The first thing Jim noticed when he stepped off the plane in San Francisco in 1971 was the noise, or rather the lack of it. No artillery in the distance, no rotors chopping through humid air, no radio static spitting orders in code, just the low rumble of baggage carts on the tarmac, the occasional shout of a ground crewman, and somewhere, faint music from a transistor radio. The air smelled different, too. Even with the tang of jet fuel, it was cleaner, lighter, without the damp, metallic weight of Southeast Asia. He stood for a moment at the gate, duffel bag over his shoulder, scanning the terminal. Soldiers in various shades of fatigue uniforms moved through the crowd, some with families rushing toward them, others walking alone. A few civilians averted their eyes as they passed, a reaction Jim would come to know well in the years ahead. Mary was waiting near the exit. She wasn't wearing her nurse's whites today, just a blue dress and a wool coat, but her posture was the same, straight and assured. She smiled when she saw him, though her eyes were wet. They had met 2 years earlier when she was a young nurse volunteering at a base hospital in Texas. Letters had been their lifeline through his deployment, and now here she was, solid and warm in his arms. "You're thinner," she said into his shoulder. "Food's not great over there," he replied with a tired grin. "But the company's worse." She laughed softly, then pulled back to look at him. "Let's get you home." Home turned out to be a small rented house in Wichita, close enough to the VA hospital where Jim would take a civilian post. At first, life seemed almost too quiet. He would wake at night expecting to hear rain on canvas, the staccato pop of rifles. Instead, there was only the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. Work kept him grounded. The VA clinic was always full, old vets from Korea, new ones from Vietnam, all carrying something invisible under their skin. Jim liked the pace, the feeling that his hands still had purpose. He built a reputation quickly, calm under pressure, willing to stay late, never turning a patient away. Mary and Jim married the following spring. A year later, their daughter Emily arrived, red-faced, loud-voiced, with a grip that surprised him even then. The house grew warmer, fuller. Evenings were spent on the porch swing, Emily in his lap, Mary beside him with a cup of tea. For a while it felt like the war had receded to the far edges of memory. The first cough came in 1976. He brushed it off as a stubborn cold, though it lingered for weeks. By the end of the year, there were 2 or 3 bouts like it, always deep, always leaving him short of breath. Mary began to notice other things, how he sat down more often at work, how his knees seemed stiff in the mornings, how sometimes his hands shook just a little when he reached for his coffee. One afternoon, while stitching up a young vet's hand after a workshop accident, Jim felt a sudden lightness in his head. The needle slipped. He caught himself just before it broke the skin. The room tilted for a second, then righted itself. He finished the work, smiled at the patient, and went into the break room to sit down. Tom Ellis, another doctor at the clinic, walked in and raised an eyebrow. "You look like you just pulled a double in the ER. Guess I'm out of shape," Jim said. Tom studied him for a moment, then said quietly, "You should get checked out." But Jim didn't. Not then. It wasn't until 1980, when he coughed up blood in the middle of a consultation with a patient that he agreed to tests. Emily, now 8, had been sitting in the corner drawing in her notebook when it happened. Her wide eyes followed the dark stain on his handkerchief, then lifted to his face. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice small. He smiled as if it were nothing, but the weight of her gaze stayed with him all the way to the radiology lab. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Mary, he didn't tell her the full results, just that they'd found some scarring in one lung. The truth was worse. The entire right lung was compromised, a hard fibrous mass where healthy tissue should have been. The doctor had mentioned exposure-related damage and irreversible, words that lodged in his mind like shrapnel. Mary reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "We'll figure it out," she said. He nodded, but deep down, he knew the war had found a way to follow him home. The VA hospital in Wichita smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. The waiting room chairs were hard plastic, the kind that seemed to discourage lingering. Jim sat in one near the corner, flipping through a dog-eared copy of National Geographic without really seeing the pictures. His chest still ached from the coughing fit 2 nights ago, and the taste of iron lingered in his mouth. James Walker? He looked up to see Dr. Alan Brewer standing at the doorway. Brewer was in his 40s, tall and slightly stooped, with the tired eyes of a man who had spent too many years breaking bad news. In the exam room, Brewer closed the door and gestured for Jim to sit on the exam table. He pulled a folder from under his arm and set it on the counter. "We've reviewed your x-rays and pulmonary function tests," he began, his tone measured. "Your right lung is almost completely fibrotic, scar tissue. Left lung's compensating, but it's under strain. Your oxygen saturation drops with minimal exertion." Jim gave a dry half smile. "I've noticed." Brewer didn't return the smile. "This isn't from smoking, and it's not typical pneumonia scarring. I've seen this pattern before, mostly in vets who served in areas sprayed with Agent Orange." Jim leaned back slightly. "We went through a patch of it, yeah. Night op, couple casualties. Didn't think much of it at the time. That patch," Brewer said, "might have been enough. The dioxin in Agent Orange doesn't just vanish. It lingers in fat tissue, can trigger inflammation years later. Respiratory damage, joint issues, nerve problems. Sometimes it hits the heart." Jim absorbed the words in silence. Brewer went on, "I need you to seriously consider reducing your workload. No more double shifts. Limit anything that leaves you winded. You push too hard, you're going to speed this up." "I've still got patients counting on me," Jim said. "You can't help them if you're in a hospital bed, or worse," Brewer replied, his voice firm now. "This isn't about willpower, Captain. It's chemistry. The stuff is inside you." Jim looked away, fixing his gaze on a framed print of a Kansas wheat field hanging on the wall. The gold expanse seemed almost unreal under the fluorescent light. "What's the timeline?" he asked quietly. "Hard to say," Brewer admitted. "Years if you're careful, less if you're not." The ride home felt longer than usual. Mary didn't press him for details when he walked through the door. She had learned to read the set of his shoulders, the way he kept his voice steady. Emily was sprawled on the living room rug, coloring in a book, and she looked up with a quick smile. He managed to return it. Later that night, after Mary and Emily had gone to bed, Jim sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He poured himself a small glass of water and stared at the condensation sliding down the side. That was when he remembered the envelope. It had arrived 2 weeks earlier, forwarded from an old Army P.O. box he barely remembered. He'd tossed it into the top drawer of his desk, unopened. Now he fetched it, sitting back down with it under the warm yellow light of the kitchen lamp. The return address was New York City. The handwriting was neat, but unmistakably hurried, as if the writer had been trying to get the words onto the paper before they slipped away. In the upper left corner, Claire Adams. The name pulled at a memory. Heat, noise, the blur of someone crouched near a sandbag wall with a camera, hair tied back under a scarf. Claire had been a war correspondent, embedded with their unit for a few weeks in '69. She'd asked too many questions, gotten too close to the action, and had the kind of sharp eyes that made you feel like she was memorizing your face. He turned the envelope over in his hands but didn't open it. Not tonight. Instead, he slid it back into the drawer, telling himself he'd read it when the time was right. Somehow, he knew the words inside wouldn't be about the war so much as about the man who had walked through it, and he wasn't sure he was ready to see himself from someone else's vantage point. The memory came back to Jim the way they often did, without warning, triggered by nothing more than the scent of damp earth after a Kansas rain. One moment he was in his backyard, watching clouds drift over the wheat fields. The next, he was back in Vietnam, 1970, in a darkness so thick it seemed to muffle even the gunfire. They had been ordered out just before midnight. A patrol was pinned down near a cluster of ruined huts 3 clicks from the base. 2 wounded, 1 critical. The helicopters couldn't risk the approach, too much small arms fire in the area, so it was up to the medics on foot. Jim and Corporal Tommy Reed had been working together for almost a year by then. Tommy was quick with a joke, even quicker with his hands in the field. He could improvise a splint from a rifle stock and half a roll of duct tape, and he had a way of talking to wounded men that kept them calm even when the pain was unbearable. That night, the jungle was slick from a day-long rain. The air clung to their skin like wet cloth. They moved single file, the moon just a pale blur behind the clouds. Somewhere ahead, a flare went up, painting the treetops in ghostly light before fading back into black. They found the first casualty propped against a wall of sandbags, a young sergeant with a leg wound. He was pale but lucid, teeth clenched against the pain. Jim left him in Tommy's care and went to find the second. The critical one was lying half in, half out of a collapsed hut, his breathing shallow, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Jim crouched beside him, pressing a dressing to the wound. "You're gonna be all right, son," he said, though he knew the boy couldn't hear him over the ringing in his own ears. Tommy's voice cut through the darkness. "We're set here, Cap. Let's move." They worked fast, lifting the wounded onto makeshift stretchers. Jim took the rear of the second one, Tommy at the front. The sergeant hobbled behind them, leaning on a rifle as a crutch. The path back to the tree line was narrow, flanked by dense undergrowth on both sides. They were maybe 200 yards from the extraction point when it happened. A sharp metallic click, so faint Jim almost missed it. Tommy froze mid-step. His head turned just enough for Jim to see his eyes. "Jim," he began. The explosion was more of a muffled whump than a sharp blast, but it lifted Tommy off his feet and threw him sideways into the brush. The stretcher dropped from Jim's hands. He was on his knees in an instant, pushing through leaves and smoke. Tommy was lying on his back, his right leg mangled, the ground around him slick. His helmet was gone, his face pale under a sheen of sweat. Jim's training took over. He tore open his kit, clamping the femoral artery, packing what he could. "Stay with me, Tommy. Just hold on." Tommy's hand gripped his wrist with surprising strength. "You gotta get them out, Jim. Don't waste time on me. You're not dying here," Jim said, his voice low, firm. "Not tonight." Tommy managed a crooked smile, the kind he used when he didn't believe a word. "You always were the stubborn one." The sergeant had taken over, holding pressure on the chest wound of the other casualty, shouting for them to move. Gunfire cracked somewhere behind them, closer now. Jim looked at Tommy's leg, at the blood still seeping through, and knew what the numbers said. But leaving him there was not something his mind could form into action. "Listen," Tommy said, his voice weaker now. "Promise me something." Jim's throat felt tight. "What?" "As long as you can breathe. You keep serving. Doesn't matter how, doesn't matter where, just keep at it." Jim stared at him, the jungle noise fading into a dull roar. He nodded once. "I promise." Tommy's grip loosened, then fell away. The breath that left him was slow, final. There was no time to stop. Jim closed Tommy's eyes, pulled the tags from his neck, and slung his med pack over his own shoulder. He lifted the other stretcher again, his arms shaking from more than just exertion. They pushed through the last stretch of jungle, the extraction team waiting with flashlights cutting narrow beams through the dark. Hours later, back at the field hospital, Jim sat on the edge of his cot with Tommy's tags in his hand. The metal was still warm from the heat of his chest. Outside, the rain had started again, steady and unrelenting. He turned the tags over, reading the name in the dim light. The promise felt heavy, like a weight he'd carry in his pocket for the rest of his life. And in the quiet, with the rain drumming the canvas overhead, he said it out loud, sealing it with the only witness left to hear: "As long as I can breathe, I will serve." The first time was in 1993. Jim had been at his desk at the VA clinic, finishing up patient notes, when the familiar tightness began to coil in his chest. It wasn't sharp, not at first, more like a slow, heavy squeeze, as if someone were pressing a board against his ribs. He thought he could ride it out. He'd worked through pain before, but then the room tilted and the pen rolled from his hand. Mary was the one who insisted on calling an ambulance. The last thing he remembered before the ER lights burned into his eyes was her voice somewhere above him, firm but trembling. "Don't you dare leave me here, James Walker." They called it a triple bypass. He woke up to the sterile smell of the ICU, tubes in his arms, monitors clicking in steady rhythm. The surgeon explained that blockages in his arteries had been worse than expected. Scar tissue, age, and years of strain had turned his heart into a stubborn machine, still running, but inefficient. The second surgery came only 4 years later. Same tightness, this time while mowing the lawn on a July afternoon. He'd been sweating under the Kansas sun, the grass thick and stubborn, when the world narrowed to a tunnel and the mower handle slipped from his grip. Emily, then a teenager, found him kneeling in the yard, one hand clutching his shirt. By the third time, in 2001, Emily was in college. The call came to her dorm at 3 a.m. She drove 6 hours straight, arriving at the hospital in the same jeans and sweatshirt she'd thrown on in the dark. She stood at the foot of his bed, arms crossed, her face pale and drawn. "You scared me," she said flatly. "I'm fine," he told her, though his voice was hoarse. "You're not fine. You never take care of yourself. You take care of everybody else, and you leave what's left for us." She stopped, biting her lip. "I don't want to lose you before you even meet my kids." Her words stayed with him longer than the pain from the incision. The fourth surgery was the hardest physically. Scar tissue from the previous procedures made each incision more difficult, each bypass more delicate. Lying under the bright, cold lights, sedatives pulling him under, Jim felt the line between present and past blur. The hiss of the oxygen mask became the rush of monsoon rain. The metallic clink of surgical instruments became the rattle of shell casings hitting the ground. He was back in the tent, hands steady over a young soldier's open abdomen, the air thick with smoke and antiseptic. He heard Tommy's voice somewhere in the distance, "Promise me something." And the monitor beep became the slow, fading heartbeat of a man he couldn't save. In 2010, surgery number 5 came after a scare at a veterans benefit dinner. He'd been in the middle of a speech when his breath caught, the words dissolving into a fit of coughing. He waved off offers to call an ambulance, but Mary overruled him. The doctors found a new blockage and scheduled him within days. The 6th time, in 2014, nearly ended him. They said his heart stopped for 11 seconds. In that gap, Jim found himself standing in the middle of a drenched rice paddy, the rain falling hard enough to sting. Tommy was there, whole and unhurt, smiling that crooked grin. Michael Harris stood beside him, young again, his uniform clean, no shrapnel in sight. "You can come with us," Tommy said. "It's easier than staying." Jim looked at them both, felt the pull of that easier road. But then he saw Mary's face, older now, lined with worry, and Emily's children running barefoot through a backyard in the summer. "Not yet," he said. The rain faded into the sound of a flatline. A moment later the beep returned, slow and steady. He opened his eyes to the white ceiling of the ICU, the sharp smell of antiseptic, and Mary's hand wrapped around his. Each surgery left its mark, not just on his chest but on his marriage, on his relationship with Emily, on his sense of time. 6 pale scars now curved down from his collarbone, each one a chapter in the same stubborn story. He sometimes traced them absent-mindedly while sitting alone, feeling the raised edges under his fingertips. They were ugly, but they were proof that he'd come back, again and again, from places where he shouldn't have. Still, the toll was undeniable. His right knee swelled more often now, a constant reminder of joints eroded by years of strain and inflammation. His breath came shorter, his hands sometimes shook, but each morning, he dressed, put on his shoes, and found a way to keep going. Because a promise made in the dark, under the sound of rain and gunfire, was not something you broke, not while you still had breath in your body. The anesthetic crept through his veins like a slow tide, cold at first, then warm, pulling him down. The lights above blurred, their sterile white edges melting into one another. Voices echoed somewhere overhead, measured, professional, but already they sounded far away. Jim let his eyes close, expecting the blank nothing of deep sedation. But there was no nothing. The first sensation was wetness, rain, warm and heavy, pelting his face and soaking through his clothes. He opened his eyes to find himself standing ankle-deep in a flooded rice paddy. The horizon was swallowed by low clouds, the air thick with the smell of mud and cordite. Somewhere far off, artillery thumped like a slow, giant heartbeat. He knew this place. He had walked it 50 years ago. Through the curtain of rain, 2 figures emerged. Tommy Reed was first, helmet pushed back, grin crooked as ever. Beside him, Michael Harris, 19 again, uniform clean, no blood on his chest, no IV tubes snaking from his arm. Both looked as solid and real as the ground beneath Jim's boots. "You took your time," Tommy said, shaking his head. "We've been waiting." Jim glanced around, scanning the horizon for movement, half expecting to see the med tent or the flash of a flare. Where am I? Tommy's grin softened. You know where. Question is, are you staying? Michael stepped forward, eyes bright. It's easier here, Captain. No pain, no fighting to breathe, no surgeries, no monitors, no needles, just peace. Jim felt the pull of their words, the strange comfort of the rain, the way the air didn't burn his lungs here. For a moment he imagined setting down the weight he'd carried for so long, the scars, the swollen knee, the constant fatigue. But then other images intruded. Mary in the kitchen, her hair pulled back, the faint lines around her eyes deepening when she smiled, Emily on the porch swing, her children laughing at her feet, the rows of veterans in the town hall, leaning on canes, waiting for someone to tell them their fight still mattered. I can't, he said finally. Tommy tilted his head. Can't or won't? Both, Jim said. I made a promise. The rain softened to a mist. Tommy's grin widened again, but this time it carried a trace of pride. Then you'd better get moving. Time's short on your side. Michael reached out, placing a firm hand on Jim's shoulder. We'll see you when it's time. Not before. The mist thickened, swallowing the patties, the rain, the figures. The sound of the artillery faded, replaced by a long flat tone, steady and unbroken. For a heartbeat, Jim thought it was the end. Then the tone broke into a stuttered beeping. Voices sharpened, urgent, close by. Heart rate's back. Hold him steady. Light stabbed through his eyelids. The smell of antiseptic returned, sharp and real. His chest ached as though someone had driven a fist into it. He tried to breathe and felt the drag of the ventilator. A blurry shape leaned over him, one of the surgical team, sweat beading on his brow. Welcome back, Captain, the man said with a tired smile. Jim wanted to reply, but the tube in his throat turned the words to silence. Instead, he closed his eyes again, not to drift away, but to hold on to the echo of rain and the faces that had sent him back. Later, when they wheeled him into recovery, he lay staring at the ceiling, the rhythm of the heart monitor steady beside him. Every beat felt like a footstep, carrying him further from that threshold and back into the life he hadn't finished living. And somewhere deep inside, under the exhaustion and the pain, was the quiet certainty that he'd made the only choice he could. The town hall smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish, the kind of scent that clung to the paneling no matter how many coats of paint it wore. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a long table where the city council sat. Outside, late autumn sunlight filtered through tall windows, catching dust motes that hung in the still air. Jim sat near the front, his cane resting against his leg, Mary beside him. The turnout was larger than he'd expected. Veterans in ball caps embroidered with the names of their units, a few younger faces in jeans and hoodies, local reporters with notepads poised. At the center of the council table sat Councilman Brad Keller, a man in his 50s with the polished look of someone who'd spent more time in boardrooms than in the field. His suit was dark, his tie crisp, and when he spoke, his voice carried the easy cadence of practiced persuasion. We all respect our veterans, Keller began, hands spread in a gesture of sincerity. But respect doesn't mean we can open the city budget without limits. The proposed expansion of the Veterans Health Fund will cost taxpayers nearly $2 million over the next 5 years. That's money we simply don't have. Murmurs rippled through the room. Jim felt his jaw tighten. Keller continued, and let's be honest, some of these claims are based on theories, not facts. Agent Orange exposure, for example. The VA has its list of presumptive conditions, sure, but not every case can be linked. We can't throw taxpayer money at every story without evidence. That last word, story, landed like a slap. Jim felt the heat rise in his chest, though it wasn't the kind that signaled heart trouble. He leaned forward, gripping his cane. Councilman, may I? Keller looked surprised, but gestured for him to stand. Jim rose slowly, each movement deliberate. His right knee ached, and the cane clicked softly against the wooden floor as he stepped toward the front. My name's James Walker, he began, his voice steady but carrying a gravelly edge that came from years of speaking over rotor blades and gunfire. I served as a combat surgeon in Vietnam from '69 to '71. I've had 6 heart surgeries, 1 lung left, and enough scar tissue in my body to keep a medical student busy for a week. All of it, every single thing, traced back to a night I walked into a mist that wasn't rain. The room had gone quiet. Even Keller's polished smile had faded a notch. I didn't have the luxury of asking for evidence before I went in, Jim continued. 2 men were down. One was choking on his own blood. The other couldn't walk. We carried them out through that haze because that's what you do when you've sworn an oath to bring your people home. And that haze, Agent Orange, came home with me. A veteran in the back nodded slowly, eyes fixed on Jim. Keller cleared his throat. "Mr. Walker, with respect, your experience is powerful, but anecdotal. We have to look at data." Jim cut him off, not with volume, but with the kind of quiet that draws people closer. "Data doesn't hold your hand in the ICU. Data doesn't watch your daughter cry because you can't walk her down the aisle without stopping to breathe. Data doesn't tell you why your buddies are dying 10, 20 years younger than they should. I've read the studies. I've lived the study." The silence stretched. Somewhere, a camera shutter clicked. Mary's hand tightened around the back of his chair. Jim could feel his pulse climbing, but he held Keller's gaze. "You asked for evidence. I'm standing here. That's your evidence. And I'm not the only one." A murmur of agreement swept the room. One of the younger veterans stood and said, "Councilman, we're not asking for handouts. We're asking for what we earned." Keller shifted in his seat, glancing toward the other council members. "We'll take all comments into consideration before the vote," he said finally, but the confidence had drained from his tone. Jim returned to his seat slowly, lowering himself with care. Mary leaned in close. "You shouldn't push yourself like that," she whispered. He gave her a faint smile. "I wasn't pushing. I was standing." Outside the tall windows, the light had shifted, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. Jim could feel the ache in his chest settling in, but he also felt something else, an old familiar steadiness, like the weight of his scalpel in his hand all those years ago. The Veterans Day ceremony was held in the town's old community hall, a brick building that smelled faintly of sawdust and history. Rows of folding chairs filled the room, their metal legs scraping the hardwood floor as people shuffled in. The stage was simple, just a wooden podium and a pair of flags, one American, one POW MEA, standing side by side. Jim sat in the front row, his cane resting across his lap. Mary was beside him, her hand occasionally brushing against his as if to reassure herself he was really there. The hall buzzed with conversation, old friends greeting each other, the clink of coffee cups from a refreshment table at the back, the occasional laugh that cut through the hum. Then he saw her. Emily stood near the entrance, a winter coat draped over her arm, her hair pulled back. She spotted him and made her way down the aisle, smiling in that cautious way of someone who isn't sure if they're welcome. "You came," Jim said when she reached him. "Wouldn't miss it," she replied, squeezing his shoulder gently. When the master of ceremonies called his name, Jim rose slowly. The cane clicked against the stage steps, each one deliberate. He took his place behind the podium, glancing out at the sea of faces, some lined and weathered, others young and intent, many wearing caps stitched with unit numbers and battlefields. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying the rasp of years but still steady. "My name is James Walker. Some of you know me, some of you served with men I knew, some of you are the reason I'm still standing here." He told them about 1969, about the med tent lit by a single kerosene lamp, about the 19-year-old soldier named Michael Harris whose life hung on the strength of a makeshift bypass and a helicopter ride through enemy fire. He spoke of Tommy Reed, his grin, his steady hands, and the promise Jim had made over his dying body. The hall was silent except for his voice. Even the kids in the back had stopped fidgeting. "I came home with medals I didn't ask for, scars I can't forget, and something else. Something invisible. We called it the mist. The government called it Agent Orange. It's in my lungs, in my joints, in my blood. But it's not the worst thing I carried back. The worst thing is watching the men who walked through that same mist die too young, too sick, without the help they earned." He paused, resting both hands on the podium to steady himself. "We don't get to choose the battles we fight. Sometimes they follow us home, but as long as I can breathe, I'll keep serving. That's what we do. That's who we are." From the corner of his vision, he saw Emily watching him, her eyes glistening. He let his gaze linger on her for a moment before looking back at the audience. "So if you know a veteran, talk to them. Listen. Don't wait for them to tell you what they need. And if you see a chance to stand up for them, take it. We didn't come this far to be silent now." Applause began softly, then grew until it filled the hall. Jim stepped back from the podium, giving a small nod of thanks. He turned toward the steps, cane in hand, but as he did, the edges of his vision blurred. The applause became a muffled roar, distant and hollow. Mary was on her feet in an instant. Emily moved quickly down the aisle. Jim's grip on the cane loosened, and it clattered against the stage floor. "Dad!" Emily's voice cut through the noise just as his knees buckled. Strong hands caught him before he hit the ground. Someone shouted for a medic, an ironic echo from another lifetime. The flags beside the podium wavered slightly in the draft as the room shifted into urgent motion. Jim could hear voices, but they seemed far away now. He thought of Tommy in the rain, of Michael on the stretcher, of the promise he'd made. And then, as the darkness pressed in, he thought of the stage tomorrow, and how he still had more to say. The room was dim except for the soft glow of a lamp over the sink. Machines hummed in the background, their steady rhythms punctuated by the occasional beep from the heart monitor beside the bed. Jim lay propped up on 2 thin pillows, the oxygen cannula snug under his nose. His chest felt heavy, as if each breath had to be coaxed from somewhere deep inside. Mary sat in the chair closest to him, her coat draped over the back, hair pulled into a loose braid that had come undone in strands around her face. She had taken off her shoes, curling 1 foot beneath her, but she hadn't moved in hours except to adjust his blanket or refill his water. They said it was close this time, she said finally, her voice low, as if speaking too loudly might tip the balance. Jim managed a faint smile. I've heard that before. This isn't funny, James. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. You collapsed in front of 100 people. Emily's still shaken. I'm still shaken. I was doing what I promised, he said. Speaking for the ones who can't. Mary's eyes searched his, her expression a mixture of love, fear, and frustration. And what about speaking for us? For me? For Emily? For your grandkids? We're still here, Jim. We still need you. He looked away, focusing on the shadows the lamp cast on the far wall. I don't know how to stop. Serving. It's the only thing that's ever made sense to me. Out there in the jungle, in the tent, on that stage, it's all the same. You do what has to be done until you can't anymore. Mary reached into her purse and pulled out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. She unfolded it carefully, revealing a simple silver cross, its edges worn smooth. This was my father's, she said, holding it up so the light caught on the metal. He carried it through the war in Korea. When he died, he left it to me. I've kept it all these years. I think you should have it now. Jim hesitated. Mary, not because you need protection, she interrupted gently, but because you need to remember there's more than one kind of service. Sometimes it's standing in front of a room and fighting for what's right. Sometimes it's staying alive so you can be here for the people who love you. She placed the cross in his hand, curling his fingers around it. Her hand lingered there, warm and steady. You've carried enough weight alone. Let this remind you. You don't have to. Jim stared at their joined hands, the cool metal pressing into his palm. The cross was small, but in that moment it felt solid enough to anchor him. Outside the window, the wind rattled the bare branches of the trees, a hollow sound against the glass. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse's shoes squeaked faintly on the linoleum. Mary leaned closer, her forehead almost touching his. Let's pray, she said simply. They bowed their heads together, and she began to speak softly, her words weaving through the quiet hum of the machines. She prayed for strength, for healing, for the wisdom to know when to keep fighting and when to rest. She prayed for Emily and the children, for the friends Jim had lost, for the strangers who would never know his name but had walked through the same haze. Jim's lips moved with hers when she reached Isaiah 4:1-10. Fear not, for I am with you, be not dismayed, for I am your God. The verse rolled through him like a slow current, carrying away some of the heaviness in his chest. When they finished, Mary brushed her fingers along his jaw. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll see what's next. Jim nodded, though sleep felt far away. She settled back into the chair, her hand still resting lightly on his arm. Sometime after midnight, he stirred at the sound of the door opening. A tall man in scrubs stepped inside, his ID badge catching the light. He was younger than Jim had expected, maybe in his 40s, with eyes that seemed both sharp and familiar. Mr. Walker, the man said, his voice quiet but clear. I'll be your new attending for the next few days. I'm Dr. Michael Harris. For a moment, Jim thought he'd misheard. Then the name settled in his mind like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples through decades of memory. The 19-year-old on the stretcher, the rain, the makeshift bypass. The doctor smiled faintly. It's been a long time, Captain. For a long moment, Jim just stared at the man in front of him, the name echoing in his head like the distant roll of thunder. Michael Harris. He'd said it out loud in that rain-soaked tent half a century ago, urging the 19-year-old to hold on while the lamp flickered overhead. The doctor stepped closer, his expression open, tinged with something almost like relief. I wasn't sure you'd remember me, he said. Jim's voice came out rough. You were just a kid. Pleku. Shrapnel to the abdomen. Michael nodded. You put in a temporary bypass with IV tubing. Got me on the chopper before the bleeding took me out. I woke up in a field hospital with people telling me I was lucky. They didn't know how lucky. Jim leaned back against the pillows, the oxygen hissing softly beside him. "And now you're a heart surgeon." A faint smile crossed Michael's face. "Funny how life works. You spend decades training to save lives, knowing full well you only have yours because someone else did the same." He paused, his gaze steady. "I've kept track of you over the years. News from mutual contacts, your work at the VA, the advocacy. When I saw your name on the incoming list this morning, I asked to take your case." Jim's brow furrowed. "My case?" Michael pulled a chair closer and sat, his hands resting loosely on his knees. "Your tests show critical blockages. The previous grafts are failing. We need to do a complex bypass, likely your last viable option." "Last option," Jim repeated quietly. "There's a 38% risk," Michael said, not sugarcoating it. "Given your lung capacity and the state of your knee, recovery will be tough. But without the surgery, you're looking at maybe months. A year if you're very lucky." Jim absorbed the words, watching the slow rise and fall of the chest monitor's green line. "You're saying this is it. Either we do it now or we don't do it at all." "That's right," Michael said, "and I'd like to be the one in the OR with you. To return the favor, if you'll let me." Jim looked at him for a long time, searching for the young man under the surgeon's calm exterior. The rain was in his memory again, the sound of rotor blades, Tommy's voice urging him to keep moving. He remembered leaning close to Michael on that stretcher, telling him he was going home. "You don't owe me anything," Jim said finally. Michael shook his head. "That's where you're wrong. That night, you ignored your own safety, your own orders to save me. I've carried that with me every day. It's why I went into surgery, why I work at the VA, why I'm standing here right now." For a moment, neither spoke. Outside the window, a branch tapped lightly against the glass in the wind. Jim exhaled slowly. 38%, he murmured, more to himself than to Michael. "I know the numbers are scary," Michael said, his tone softening. "But I've done harder cases, and I've seen what happens when we let the clock run out. I'm not ready to watch yours run out without a fight." Jim felt Mary's hand slip into his from the other side of the bed. He glanced at her. She said nothing, but her eyes told him she'd heard every word. "You really think you can pull it off?" Jim asked Michael. Michael's smile was small but certain. "Captain, you didn't give me a choice back then. I'm not giving you one now." For the first time in days, Jim laughed, a low, rough sound that caught in his chest. "All right," he said, "let's do it. But if I don't make it, you make sure Mary and Emily know I went in on my own terms." "You'll make it," Michael said, standing. "We start at dawn." As he left the room, Jim lay back and closed his eyes. The weight of the silver cross Mary had given him rested in his palm, the cool metal grounding him. Somewhere in the dark behind his eyelids, the rain began again, but this time it felt less like a warning and more like a blessing. The first thing Jim heard was the slow, steady beep of the monitor. The sound was faint at first, like it was coming from the other end of a long tunnel, but it grew clearer with each breath he took. His chest felt like someone had laid a slab of stone across it, heavy and unyielding, but the rhythm of air moving in and out told him he was still here. He opened his eyes to a haze of fluorescent light. The ceiling tiles swam into focus. Then a shadow moved into view. Michael, wearing a light blue scrub jacket over his surgical greens. "You made it," Michael said, his voice calm but carrying a note of satisfaction. Jim tried to speak, but his throat was raw, his words rasping out in little more than a whisper. 38%. Michael's mouth twitched into a faint smile. "And we beat the odds. The grafts are holding. Circulation's already stronger than it's been in years." Jim's eyes shifted toward the foot of the bed. Mary sat in a chair, her head bowed in prayer, fingers still wrapped around the small silver cross. She looked up when she sensed him watching, relief flooding her face. "I told you you'd make it," she said softly, standing to take his hand. Michael glanced at her. He's going to need time, months, to rebuild strength. But the hard part's over. When she stepped out to call Emily, Michael pulled his chair closer. "I need to tell you something I didn't in the OR prep," he began. "That night in Pleiku, you weren't just the man who saved me. You were the reason I decided to live the way I have since." Jim closed his eyes briefly, remembering the rain, the weight of the stretcher, Tommy's voice in the darkness. "You told me," Michael went on. "You're going home. You've still got work to do." I didn't know what that meant at 19, but now I get it. Serving isn't just the uniform or the medals. It's what you do with the time you've been given, time someone else fought to give you. Jim looked at him steadily. "That's the job, son. You carry it forward." Michael nodded. "That's why I asked to take your case. Not to repay a debt. There's no repaying that. But to keep the chain going. You gave me time. I want to make sure you've got yours." For a moment, the only sound was the steady hum of the machines. Then Jim said quietly, "Tommy made me promise I'd serve as long as I could breathe. Guess that includes letting someone else keep me breathing." Michael smiled faintly. "I think that's exactly what it means." Mary returned then, Emily just behind her, the phone still in her hand. Emily's eyes were wet, but her smile was steady. "Grandkids want to know if Grandpa's going to be able to play catch again," she said. Jim gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Tell them they'd better start practicing." Emily laughed, a sound he hadn't realized he'd missed until now. Later that night, when the room was quiet and the hallway lights dimmed, Jim lay awake, the cross still in his hand. He thought of Tommy in the rain, Michael on the stretcher, the men who hadn't made it home, and the promise that had carried him this far. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't fighting it alone. The snow had melted early that spring, leaving the sidewalks damp and the air cool with the scent of thawing earth. Jim walked slowly up the steps of Town Hall, his cane tapping a steady rhythm. The silver cross Mary had given him rested in his shirt pocket, warm against his chest. He still moved carefully. His stamina wasn't what it once was, but there was a steadiness in his stride that hadn't been there before. Inside, the main chamber was crowded again, but this time the faces were more expectant than tense. Veterans filled the first two rows, caps and jackets marking units from Vietnam to Afghanistan. Younger residents stood along the walls, some holding hand-painted signs, "Support our vets, Agent Orange is real." Mary sat near the front, Emily beside her, both smiling as he took his seat. Michael Harris stood in the back, his arms crossed, nodding once when their eyes met. The council took their places, and at the center, Brad Keller cleared his throat. He looked less polished than the last time Jim had seen him, tie slightly loose, eyes tired. But when he spoke, his voice carried a different weight. "Before we begin the formal vote, I want to address something from our last meeting," Keller said. "That day, I questioned the legitimacy of certain veterans' health claims. I dismissed personal accounts as anecdotal. Since then, I've had conversations, hard ones, with people who've lived through what the rest of us can only imagine. I've read the studies I ignored before, and I've seen what Agent Orange has done, not in statistics, but in scars, hospital bills, and empty chairs at kitchen tables." A murmur ran through the room. Quieter than the first time, but warmer, Keller's gaze found Jim in the crowd. "Mr. Walker, you stood here weeks after collapsing on this stage, and you made your case. You said you were the evidence. You were right. You still are." Jim inclined his head slightly, not breaking eye contact. Keller turned back to the assembly. "Today, I'm voting yes on the expansion of the Veterans Health Fund, and I urge my colleagues to do the same." The roll call began. One by one, each council member gave their vote. The yeses stacked up quickly. When the final tally was read, the motion passed, unanimous. Applause erupted, echoing off the paneled walls. Some of the veterans stood, shaking hands, clapping each other on the back. Mary reached for Jim's hand, her grip firm. Emily leaned in, whispering, "You did it." Jim shook his head. "We did it." When the meeting adjourned, people gathered around him. Old comrades, younger vets, townsfolk he barely knew. Keller approached last, extending his hand. "I was wrong," Keller said simply, "and I'm grateful you didn't give up on convincing me." Jim took the handshake, his grip steady. "People can change. That's all we fight for in the end, the chance for things to get better." Outside, the late afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, casting long beams across the wet pavement. Michael caught up with him on the steps. "You handled that like a field officer," Michael said with a grin. "I was just standing," Jim replied, echoing the words he'd said to Mary months ago. The town did the rest. They walked down together, the cane tapping against the stone, the air crisp but no longer biting. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring. For the first time in years, Jim felt the weight in his chest ease, not from medicine, not from surgery, but from the quiet knowledge that a promise made long ago, in the dark and the rain, was still being kept. The spring evening was cool, the kind that carried the scent of freshly cut grass and distant lilacs. Jim sat on the back porch in a sturdy wooden chair, a blanket draped over his legs. The sun was sinking low, washing the wheat fields in a soft gold that made the horizon look almost endless. At his feet, his grandson Caleb sat cross-legged, a baseball glove still on one hand, his cap turned backward. His younger sister Lily leaned against the porch railing, listening quietly. "Grandpa," Caleb said, "Mom said you've got a scar from your neck to your belly. Is that true?" Jim chuckled softly. "I've got 6 of them. Each one tells a story. Want to hear one?" The kids nodded eagerly. Jim adjusted the blanket, taking a deep breath. A long time ago, before either of you were born, I was a doctor in the army. My job was to help soldiers who'd been hurt in battle. One night, in a place far away, we had to carry 2 wounded men through a thick mist. That mist wasn't fog, it was something called Agent Orange. I didn't know it then, but it would stay with me the rest of my life. Lily's brow furrowed. Is that why you got sick? Yes, Jim said simply. It made my heart weaker, my lungs weaker. But that night, I made a promise to my friend Tommy. I told him that as long as I could breathe, I'd keep serving, helping people however I could. Caleb tilted his head. Even when you got sick? Especially then, Jim said. Because service isn't just something you do when it's easy. It's what you do when it's hard, when it costs you something. I stood in front of people who didn't believe us, told them the truth, and kept going until they listened. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the small silver cross. The edges had worn smooth over decades of being carried close. He held it out to Caleb. This belonged to your great-grandfather, Jim said. Mary gave it to me the night before my last surgery. She told me it was to remind me that there's more than one kind of service. Sometimes it's fighting. Sometimes it's staying alive for the people who love you. Caleb took the cross carefully, running his thumb along its cool surface. Should I keep it safe? Jim smiled. Keep it close. And one day, when you see someone who needs help, even if it's not easy, even if you're tired, you remember what I'm telling you now. As long as you can breathe, you serve. Lily leaned closer. Will you tell us more stories? Jim looked out at the horizon, the sun's last light brushing the fields in gold. I've got a lifetime of them. But tonight I just want to sit here with you and listen to the wind. The 3 of them sat quietly as the light faded, the fields swaying gently in the evening breeze. Inside, Mary's voice drifted from the kitchen, humming an old hymn. Jim rested his hand lightly on Caleb's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of youth, the promise of a future he might not see but had helped make possible. The battle scars were still there, on his body, in his memories, but they no longer felt like a burden. They felt like proof that he had kept his word, proof that the chain of service would go on. And as the first stars began to show in the darkening sky, Jim Walker smiled, not the tired smile of a man at the end of his strength, but the quiet, certain smile of someone who knew he had given all he could, and that it was enough. In the end, Jim Walker's story isn't just about battles fought overseas, or scars earned in silence. It's about the quiet courage to keep serving when the world stops watching, and the choice to pass that torch to those who come after. Because service, true service, doesn't end when the uniform comes off. It lives in the moments you choose to stand for someone else, even when it costs you. As the last light fades over the wheat fields, imagine Jim on that porch, blanket over his legs, silver cross in hand, watching the stars appear one by one, knowing his promise is safe in younger hands. If you were in Jim's place, what promise would you make and keep for the rest of your life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else. And if Jim's journey moved you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more stories that remind us all, as long as we can breathe, we serve.